Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Anna Owinska and I am your technical host today. Thank you for joining us as we celebrate NAOSH Week with our webinar, Ask Me Anything Air Quality. For those who do not know us, the Manufacturing Safety Alliance of BC is a not-for-profit health and safety association serving manufacturers and food processors. We invite you to call us to answer your health and safety questions or challenges that you have to keep your workers safe. Please also visit our website for safety training and resources or information on the Occupational Safety Standard of Excellence core certification for BC manufacturers. At this time, we would like to introduce you to our speaker today, Jasmine Kelsey. She's the Industrial Hygiene Specialist at the Alliance who will speak about air quality and answer any questions you might have pertaining to this topic. Jasmine, welcome.
All right, thank you, Anna. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can I just get a, Anna, my screen's up?
Yeah, we're all set.
Okay, perfect. All right, thank you. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the one of many webinars we planned for this week. So this Ask Me Anything session is about air quality. Before we get started, just a brief introduction of myself. My name is Jasmine Kelsey, and I'm an industrial hygienist at the Manufacturing Safety Alliance of BC. My role mainly involves the anticipation, recognition, evaluation, and control of factors arising from the workplace, which can affect the health and safety of workers. So part of this role relies very heavily on air quality assessments, which is the main topic of this session. So for this webinar, the way I have it organized is to first start off with a quick presentation on air quality basics. And we're going to end off with some regulatory overview. And then once the presentation aspect is done, I'm going to open the floor up for the Ask Me Anything session. So just please try holding on to your questions until then, unless it's something very pressing against the content that I am presenting on. The presentation aspect, it's short and sweet, so we'll get your questions answered as soon as possible once the presentation aspect is done. So let's get started. So when it comes to air quality, the first thing that comes to mind is pollution or air quality index or dust fumes. And sometimes we even start thinking about the weather because that's something we're always used to, right? So air quality is defined as the degree to which the ambient air is pollution free, assessed by measuring a number of indicators of pollution. So when you think about this definition, we would think, does this definition apply to our workplaces? And the answer would be yes, to an extent. In the end, in simple terms, we are assessing how much pollution there is in the air, in simple terms. So when we think about air quality, we typically use different terms to describe it, to describe what we see even in the workplace, or even at home, to be honest. And what I want to do in this session is to go over these common terms that we use. And we want to make sure that we're using the right term when we're describing the issue that we see. So the terms that we typically use would be something like aerosols, or there's smoke, or there's fume, or there's dust. So in the next few slides, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over these definitions. So then once we're using them in the field, we're using them in the right way. Because common times what happens is when I'm interacting with my clients, the way we describe our concerns related air quality, we generally tend to mix these type of terms. So we're going to start with aerosols. So aerosols are defined as liquids which have atomized into droplets in the air. And a relevant example that we all should be familiar with is spray paint or even pesticide spraying. Subcategories of aerosols include fog, mist, drizzle, and rain. And as you can see, let me do this go. So when we look into fog, mist, drizzle, and rain, the only difference between these subcategories are the size of the droplet itself. So typically when we're trying to describe it, again, it factors heavily on the size of the particle. Next, we have our dusts. So dusts are defined as irregular shaped particles generated by some type of disintegration process, which creates particles in smaller and smaller sizes. So when we interact with dust, typically the type of task we would see, particularly in like our work sites, would be processes such as sanding, sawing, grinding operations. And the most common type of example that we would typically encounter would be wood dust. And that's something it's something that we frequently see, right? The typical size of dust particles, they range anywhere between 0.5 to 500 microns. Next, we have smoke. So we typically use this term to describe air quality. So when we look into the proper definition of it, smoke is defined as spherical particles that is produced by the combustion of carbonaceous material. The typical size fraction for smoke generally ranges between 0.01 to 1 microns. An example of smoke, the most common one would be wood fire. And next we have fumes. So fumes are defined as particles created after the combustion of non-carbonaceous materials like metals. So they're somewhat similar to smoke, except now we're looking into non-carbonation materials. The size fraction ranges anywhere between 0.01 to 5 microns as well. And again, the most common type of example that we see would be welding fumes. And this is something that is very apparent in the manufacturing sector. And is something that generally most sites have taking place within their one of the tasks that are being done by workers. So when we're looking into all these terms that we just discussed, so this chart, to put it into perspective, just take a look at the chart that I have on the slide. Here, the majority of the terms that we discussed are mentioned. Aerosols such as fog, mist, rain are listed at the top right, fog having the smallest of the diameter out of the three, and this is all arranged in the particle diameter. And then the bottom of the chart, we have fumes and dust, and here dust being larger in particle diameter than fumes. So I've put a lot of emphasis on particle diameter, and that is with reason. When we think about aerosols or dust or fumes, or even when we're about to assess it or test it, meaning like even collect ambient air samples, the diameter is important. And the reason why it's important is the particle diameter will dictate how far something will travel down a respiratory system. So typically, the smaller the diameter, the smaller the size fraction, the further it will travel down our respiratory system. So these size fractions can be divided into three categories. So you have the total fraction, you have the thoracic fraction, and then you have lastly the respirable fraction. So the total or inhalable fraction can be described as particles anywhere between 0 to 100 microns. And these would be particles which can be inhaled through the nose or mouth. They don't travel too far down our respiratory system, and that's because due to its larger size. The thoracic fraction are the ones that could penetrate the head airways and enter the airways of the lungs. So you're pretty much, if you're anywhere between 0 to 25 microns, you're hitting the bronchi, you're hitting the bronchioles of your respiratory system. And then lastly, we have the respirable fraction. The particles which can penetrate the terminal bronchioles, and they enter the gas exchange region of the lungs. So when we're looking into the respirable fraction is something that can be considered as a greater hazard, just because it can potentially affect the way we breathe and how we take up oxygen. The size fraction is quite small as well, anywhere between 0 to 10 microns. So again, if it can affect the way we breathe, and especially when it's able to enter a particular region in our lungs, which is hard to extract from, it does present a higher level of hazard. So this is where it matters when we want to see the size fraction of the type of particles we are potentially exposed to. And then we want to ensure we could control around it. So we went over the different size fractions and the different terms to describe air quality, very high level. But one of the next aspects that we would want to do is to ensure that we actually identify them. So there are multiple avenues you can use to identify different air quality hazards, but one of the main ones that we would typically look into would be safety data sheets, just carrying on ongoing surveillance, so such as like your workplace inspections, you're doing your site audits, and even understanding production processes. So if you are a person that is in charge, or a person that is either a health and safety manager or the health and safety coordinator, you need to have a very good understanding of the types of operations that are taking place at your work site. It's vital. So then that's only the way you can identify and know what chemicals you're using, what type of processes are taking place, and what type of hazards workers can be exposed to. And once you know what your hazard can potentially be, you would also want to know what you would be required to do. And this is where we start to look into the regulation aspect. So in British Columbia, as you all know, WorkSafe is our regulatory body in regards to health and safety, unless your workplace falls under the federal government. So under the occupational health and safety regulations, there is a set of exposure limits, which specify what we as workers are allowed to be exposed to. And this is particularly under Part 5, Section 5.48, the exposure limits. And it reads, and just follow along with me on the slide, except as otherwise determined by the board, the employer must ensure that no worker is exposed to a substance that exceeds the ceiling limit, the short-term exposure limit, or the 8-hour TWA, which is the time-weighted average limit prescribed by ACGIH. WorkSafe BC and usually other regulatory bodies in Canada, they follow ACGIH. ACGIH is the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. It is a not-for-profit, non-regulatory group based out of the States, which through research, through their case studies and all, they recommend exposure limits. So WorkSafe BC, what they have done is they have adopted these limits that is presented by ACGIH, and they have incorporated them into our regulation. And as a result, since WorkSafe references them, they become our law. And then as a result, we are required to follow them. So when we're looking into these exposure limits, so what WorkSafe has is they have a neat tool or a neat document on their website. And this is called the table of exposure limits. So first of all, an exposure limit is the maximum allowed airborne concentration for a substance that no worker is allowed to be exposed to. The table of exposure limits, it's a document on WorkSafe BC's website. It is in PDF format, and it pretty much lists all the chemicals along with acceptable worker exposures. It doesn't have every chemical that you can possibly think of, but it does cover a good chunk. So it's, again, I'll show you a bit later on near the end of the session where you can potentially download it. But typically what it looks like would be this document here. So again, this document, it's quite a lengthy document. And what mainly it shows is a list of chemicals. So over here you have chemicals, they are in alphabetical order, and they're also listed by the CAS or the CAS number. So this number, the CAS number, is a unique identifier for every type of chemical that exists in open scientific literature. And what it is either, since it is a lengthy document, what you can do is you can either do your Control F and just search for the chemical as per the CSA number, or you could just find the chemical within the list. And within this table of exposure limits, how it's set up is it lists out the exposure limits. So you have the TWA, which is the time-weighted average. You have the STEL, which is the short-term exposure limit. And then you have the ceiling limit as well as any notations. So the TWA, that is considered as the 8-hour exposure limit. So no time a worker is allowed to be exposed. For example, let's take the example of bromochloromethane, which is the first one. So you have a TW of 200 ppm. So no time is a worker allowed to be exposed if they're working an 8-hour shift, average over 200 ppm. They're not allowed to be exposed. And if they are considered overexposed and controls need to be implemented. For the STEL is short-term exposure limit. So that is considered as the 15-minute exposure limit. So at no time, instead of 8-hour time exposure, you have a 15-minute exposure time. So at no time is a worker allowed to be exposed to more than 250 ppm, average over 15 minutes. And if you do, they are considered, again, overexposed. But as you notice, not all chemicals have STELs, not all chemicals have TWAs, or not all chemicals have ceiling limits. And again, these limits are set up as they're done from research, they're done from case studies, and sometimes there isn't a number that can be assigned to a particular chemical, or some are still under research. But for the ones that have the ceiling limit, and you have one for, if you look on the slide, you have one for the N-butylamine. So for this, there's no TWA, but there is a ceiling limit of 5 ppm. So what this means is at no time is a worker allowed to be exposed above 5 ppm. So it's not time weighted. This is pretty much like an instantaneous exposure limit. So it's just something to be mindful of. So when you're looking over your safety data sheets or you're trying to identify the type of hazards, this would kind of give you a notion, okay, what can potential exposures be like given the length of the task that is being carried out at your work site? This tool itself, the table of exposure limits, it's quite helpful in terms of the notation aspect as well. The notations itself, they usually tell you if there are any, like for example, if the chemical is a reproductive toxin or reproductive hazard. So if you look into 1-bromopropane, it has a R notation with it. And what this means is, okay, it can affect the reproductive system of the worker itself. Anything related to A2, A1, these are considered as carcinogens as identified by either by ACGIH or IARC. So the International Agency for Research on Cancer, International, it's an international body which assigns these designations. Anything that is a sensitizer, anything that can easily be absorbed by skin, as would be mentioned in this notations column. So again, these notations itself would need a little more detailed explanation. But the thing is, the good thing is in the table of exposure limits, definitions for each of these notations are provided within the start of the document. So it's always a good thing to reference, especially during your hazard assessment process. And it also can just gives a little trigger if further control is needed or needs to be investigated for a particular process using those types of controls. And just to end off this presentation aspect, once we've identified, assessed the air quality hazard, what you want to do is to ensure adequate controls are implemented. So on the slide, I have an excerpt taken directly from the regulation. So we have part 5, section 5.55. It describes the types of controls. And this is something you may already be familiar with. But in summary, the hierarchy of controls must be considered to determine the type of controls to implement. So first thought should be elimination or substitution. And if that doesn't work for a particular type of chemical or reducing the exposure where you're below the limits, then you have to consider engineering controls, such as ventilation, for example, or isolation. We have administrative controls where you can look into changing how long a particular worker is exposed to that particular hazard. So changing shift lengths, shift times, introducing rotation. And if none of that works, you can also defer to PPE. Again, PPE is considered on the very bottom of the list because again, it doesn't get rid of the hazard itself. The hazard is still there. But again, ideally, it's a good idea to have a combination of controls just with the goal of always reducing the worker exposure in the end. So the hierarchy of controls, again, it applies to any other health and safety hazard. It's not only an air quality thought process that should be used, but the control aspect would be a very important aspect to consider, especially with the types of hazards that are out there in the field, especially related to air quality. So this concludes the presentation aspect of this webinar. I appreciate your attention. Again, it was short and sweet as I promised, but I'll open up the floor to the AMA section. You can type your questions in the Q&A. You can raise your hand using the button on the bottom of the screen. But once we get these questions started, then and then we'll go from there. Thank you. Okay, so I see some questions. Can you see this? If I post up the question on my screen, can you guys see it? So then I don't have to repeat them. So
I can answer or I can read the question, Jasmine. So we have a question that has come in. I have not found information on how maximum room capacity is affected by ACH during COVID. For example, if a 120 cubic meter room has 1 ACH, how do I calculate my maximum occupancy? And how long can people stay in a shared space?
Right. So given that there are a particular set of calculations that are referred to in the regulations, what WorkCBC does, they refer to a book. It's written by the ACGIH in terms of, I believe it's on specifically on industrial ventilation. This question itself would take a little bit more of the calculation aspect, but I will hold off to this, Kirk, as it would require a little bit more detail for it. But if I can just pull up the particular book that WorkSafeBC technically refers to, The calculation aspect is within that book, because that's how all the calculations for air exchanges are done. And we have to follow that thought process. I can't think about it top of my head. I would have to refer to that book itself, but I'm gonna pull up the title itself so you have it for your reference. So let me just pull it up. So let me just share this actually. So once you're on WorkSafe BC's website, all the regulations in terms for ventilation are specified under Part 5 of the regulation. And we want to look into the ventilation aspect. So in terms of the principles around how long between, in terms of like the air changes in the calculation itself, they're all specified in this book. It would require, for me, in terms of just a little bit more research. I will hold on to that question though, Kirk, and get back to you on it to get you a good answer. But yeah, it would be the Industrial Ventilation Manual of Recommended Practice, and it is published by ACGIH, and this would be the go-to book. I don't have it with me at the moment, but I will get that answer for you. Thank you.
So Jasmine, we have another question that came in. What is the main difference between the KN95 and N95 respirators?
Okay, so this is one question that we got a few times actually over the course of the pandemic. The KN95s and the N95s technically do follow the same type of effectiveness. And that said is the KN95 and the N95. So the N95 is something that is a certification that is passed by NIOSH typically. So what the N means is, and the NIOSH, okay, so before I say that, NIOSH is a body that's in the States, and they're the ones that give their stamp of approval for the types of respirators that are acceptable within North America. In terms of WorkSafe BC, they usually want, in terms of respirators that are provided for all workers in BC, we generally want the NIOSH stamp on it, or we want NIOSH approved respirators, right? But when we look into the aspect of N95, the N aspect means it is not oil proof, and the 95 aspect means it is 95% effective against, in terms of filtration capabilities. That's what the N and the 95 mean, right? But the N95 is typically a term that is used within North America in terms of the respirators, as they are considered as NIOSH respirators. The KN95, technically, they are the equivalent of the N95. However, the KN95, they follow their certification process through China. So N95 NIOSH is an American body. They do their approvals. KN95s, technically, they are considered equivalent, but the KN95 is a designation that is provided by the standards from China. So that would be the main difference between them. But the thing is, there's lots of duplicates on the market that are being advertised in KN95s. And unfortunately, there isn't that testing standard. We can't verify that very easily in Canada. That's why we still say NIOSH is having NIOSH approved respirators, because there are particular markings on the mask itself, on the respirators itself, we want to look out for to make sure it is authentic. It's not a dupe. Where the KN95, they don't have any particular standard in terms of markings or what is acceptable or not. So it gets a little difficult to distinguish. But theory-wise, KN95 and N95 in terms of the test processes are the same. And I hope that answers your question. Otherwise, if you need further clarification on that, then please just type it in the chat, or we can unmute.
Thanks, Jasmine. Another question has come in. How might the STEL be useful to an employer?
So, okay, so the STEL itself, again, that is a 15-minute exposure limit. So sometimes we have workers that are working for a short duration, and you would only do it for that short period of time. And you might be working with a chemical, maybe it's a spray application, which probably generates a lot of vapors, or it generates a lot of dust or fumes. So in that process, a 15-minute exposure limit, it would be helpful versus then comparing to an 8-hour exposure limit. Just because that thought process would be, sometimes a chemical have both, right? A TW and a STEL. So sometimes a STEL will give you a better reference point versus an 8-hour TWA, because again, it's an average, right? So in an 8-hour average, you're allowed to probably be exposed to a particular chemical. You might hit high concentrations, and over 8-hour time, it maybe gets drowned out by that average, and it would never even be considered as a hazard. But with the STEL itself, and if a task is being done only for a short period of time, you are allowed to pick it up and determine, okay, with a STEL, 15 minutes, my worker can potentially be exposed in that short time period. And you can see further controls are needed or not. And this is particularly of concern if you have these type of chemicals that have the designations associated with it. For example, if it's like a reproductive toxin, that's something, if your workers are exposed to in that short time period, you want to make sure controls are already present. Maybe that's something that won't even get picked up in the 8-hour assessment, for example. But that would be the main, that would be a pretty much a pro of having a STEL.
Thanks, Jasmine.
Yep.
Another question that's come in is there any PPE that can be worn to filter tobacco smoke and the smell? If not, what would you recommend aside from distancing to avoid exposure?
Right. So again, in terms of the smell aspect, you can technically use, for example, like the N95. So there are different types of respirators, what they're rated at. You have the N95, you have the N97, you have the N99, for example. And again, those 95, the 99, 97, or the N100, sorry, they all go for these types of filtration capabilities, right? These masks itself they act as filters. They're not there to reduce smell. They may help though. So in terms of to filter out like tobacco smoke, you could look into even getting like a N100, for example, or like an N95. Or P100, depending on the work environment itself. But again, aside from distancing, you can go with the particulate filters, though it should be helping with tobacco smoke. I wouldn't say you would really need like the elastomeric respirators, because that would be a little bit more robust. But it also depends on like how bad the smell is.
Thanks, Jasmine.
Mm-hmm.
Another question that has just come in is, how does an employer measure the ppm to ensure exposure limits are not exceeded?
So for to determine what the concentration is in the air, so what you can do is you can do an actual assessment. So this is either personal exposure assessments, or you can do area assessments. So pretty much when we look into this table of exposure limits from WorkSafe BC, those are all relevant to worker exposure, right? So you always want to do these type of personal samples. And how it works is when we go out on site and do these types of air quality assessments, how it mainly works for air quality is, okay, there's different media that that we can get from the lab itself. But generally, workers would wear this media for the duration of the task or the duration of the shift. Generally, we would do for the duration of the shift itself. And the reason is we want to get the best representation of a typical workday. And that media, whether it be in a tube form or whether it be like a cassette, which a worker would be wearing an air pump, which will draw air through the cassette itself at a set rate, then that cassette itself gets sent to a lab. Through their process, they will determine what the concentrations of the agent that we are testing for, they would tell us. And then we compared with the WorkSafe BC limits. So it's a media that is worn by workers that gets sent to the lab. They do their analysis and they report back saying, this is the concentration for this X amount of time that the worker was wearing it for. And then that's how we get those readings. Other ways, again, every type of chemical or any type of whatever hazard that we're trying to test against, each has their particular testing method, right? Sometimes you can even use like direct reading instruments to determine what the concentration of that particular chemical is. For example, if you have like CO, carbon monoxide, or if you want like H2S, you want the concentrations of that in there. There are direct reading monitors that you can use. It's similar to the ones like, for example, the ammonia, like we can definitely use those as well to determine what the concentration of ammonia is in the air to when you're performing some type of maintenance on the refrigeration system, for example. But that would be the only way to ensure that your workers are not overexposed to a particular chemical. Another way is if you are able to find data that is of a very similar task from literature itself, and you can do like side-by-side comparison of your work tasks versus what you're seeing in literature. You can also use that data and do a comparison, and based on your risk assessment, see if your workers are overexposed or not. That would be another method. But again, you would have to have enough reason and justification to say that that data that you have, the literature that you have, is adequate and it is representative of your own employees' work as well. But that's just another process to determine it. But best way is to just get it assessed for your employees right at the spot, so you know exactly what they're exposed to.
Thank you so much.
Sorry about that. So as I was saying, if we have our list of services on our website under the services tab, and within that list, we have air quality assessment. So if you guys ever have any questions in terms of air quality, a specific process itself, we can always arrange for a scoping itself. So scopings itself are free for all members of MSIBC. And pretty much what it is a safety advisor. So either I would come out, or I have one of my colleagues, Raj, who we have a hygienist in the interior as well. He would come out. And for the scoping itself, we would pretty much determine, go over your concerns, gather enough information. If testing is something that is of a of a want, if it's a need, and we'll gather enough information to build a strategy, and then we'll get a proposal out, formulate that, get it out to you, and then if all looks good, then we move ahead with the testing process itself. But generally, if they're somewhat generic questions itself, that's something we can always get answered in the scoping meeting. Or otherwise, my contact information, if you just call our phone number, and then my contact information can also be shared at the end of this session. Just reach out to myself or Raj in the interior, and then we could get your answers to your questions for that. But that would be for the air quality aspect. And then in terms of resources that we have, so we have tons of resources in terms of like posters. We have a lot of COVID-19 resources as well, that if you need any particular ones, for example, mandatory mask policy, or previous presentations, again, they are well laid out within our website. And then the posters itself are great resources you can use definitely in your workplace as well. We also have some exposure control plans in regards to general ones for like biological contaminants. We have one specific to COVID itself. But if you need any other resources, again, it's always best to just reach out directly to myself or Raj, and then we can definitely get those out to you, so we can help answer your questions. But that would be pretty much it for our resources. Oh yeah, and then one last one. We also like to highlight the safety minute videos. So again, with the onset of the whole pandemic itself, and even just moving forward, general to specific tasks, if respirators are something that are being used in your workplace, we do have these safety minute videos that are great for like donning and doffing, how to properly how to don and doff a disposable respirator, elastomeric respirator, how to perform those seal checks that are very important to ensure your respirator is fitting right. So they're very short videos, like max a minute, but they're great resources that you can definitely use in your toolbox talks, just to ensure that everything gets covered, everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing with their respirator, and it's a great refresher as well. The seal check ones are great resources because we usually tend to forget about those. But yeah, if anything else in terms of resources that you're looking for specifically, again, it's always best to reach out direct.
Thanks so much, Jasmine. And we have shared Jasmine's and Raj's information in our chat box, so please feel free to email or call them with any follow-up questions. Perfect. So at this time, we want to thank you, Jasmine, so much for joining us today and taking a moment to host this great Ask Me Anything session. There's some great valuable information, and after the session today, we will send up a follow-up video to everybody with resources and additional information about the questions that Jasmine answered. We also like to showcase, as Jasmine showed, that there's additional resources available on our website. So please make sure to check that out for any additional info that might help. Upcoming, we also want to let you know that we have 2 additional Ask Me Anything webinar sessions taking place later this week. Join us tomorrow for ergonomics Q&A with Era Potter and Friday for incident investigation Q&A with Lauren Davies. In addition, registration is open for the May 27th webinar on Government and Industry Town Hall, the road ahead for BC business and the recovery. That's going to be with Minister of Labor Honorary Terry Baines, CEO from Sunripe, Leslie Bradley, CEO from Fine Choice Foods, Jason Longden, and CEO from Canadian Mental Health Association, Jonathan Morris. So thank you everybody for taking the time to join us today. Please take the survey in your browser or inbox afterwards to share your feedback and suggestions to help us improve future webinars. We will email you tomorrow with a link to the recorded webinar as well as the related resources. Feel free to share these amongst your teams, and we hope to see you again in the future. Thank you all and have a great and safe day.